There are two moments that define a man's life. The moment he breaks, and the moment he discovers what makes him unbreakable. This is the story of both. This is the story of what broke the billionaire and what made him impossible to destroy. His name was Alexander Hunt, 49 years old, self-made, relentless. The kind of man who turned a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire in 15 years. Fortune 500, Forbes cover, TED Talks about innovation and disruption. He had everything the world tells you matters: wealth beyond measure, influence that moved industries, respect that opened every door. And then, in a single catastrophic week, he lost it all. It started with a whistleblower, an employee who uncovered financial irregularities buried deep in the company's accounting. Within days, federal investigators arrived. Within a week, the board forced him out. Within 2 weeks, criminal charges were filed. The empire he built with his own hands was dismantled in front of the world. His face on every screen with the same words: fraud, deception, fall from grace. But that's not what broke him. The public humiliation, the legal battles, the frozen accounts, those weren't what shattered Alexander Hunt into pieces. What broke him was silence. The deafening silence that followed the collapse. Phone calls that went unanswered, text messages left unread, business partners who suddenly had prior commitments, friends of 20 years who vanished like smoke. His brother, who he had put through medical school, who he had supported through 2 failed marriages, sent a single message: "I can't be associated with this. I'm sorry." Even his fiancée, Claire, the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 months, left a note on the kitchen counter: "I fell in love with who you were. I don't know who you are now." Alexander stood in his penthouse, the one he'd have to vacate by the end of the month, holding that note. And something inside him didn't just crack, it shattered completely. He had spent his entire adult life building, creating, proving. And in the moment he needed someone, anyone, to see him as more than his success, there was no one. He wasn't a person to these people, he was a brand, a status symbol, a connection. And now that the brand was tainted, the person underneath didn't matter. That night, Alexander did something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He broke down. Not the controlled emotion of a man who still has his dignity, but the raw, animalistic sobbing of someone who has discovered they are utterly alone. He screamed into the emptiness of that penthouse, threw furniture, smashed mirrors. And when the rage finally exhausted itself, he collapsed on the floor and whispered to no one, what was it all for? What was any of it for? He stayed on that floor until sunrise. And when the light finally crept through the windows, something in Alexander had fundamentally changed. Not healed, not accepted, but broken open in a way that would either destroy him or transform him. He didn't know which yet. For the next 3 weeks, Alexander existed in a fog. He moved through the motions of life, the lawyers' meetings, the court appearances, the interviews with investigators. But he was a ghost, hollowed out, going through the rituals of his own funeral. Then, on a Tuesday morning, something unexpected happened. Alexander was walking through a park, aimless, when he saw an old man feeding pigeons. The man looked up, made eye contact, and smiled. Just a simple, genuine smile. No recognition, no judgment, no agenda. Just a human acknowledgement of another human. Alexander felt tears sting his eyes. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? Like he was just a person, not a transaction. He sat on the bench next to the old man. Neither spoke for a while. Then the man said, "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world." Alexander laughed bitterly, more like the weight of losing the world. The old man nodded thoughtfully. Losing the world or losing the illusion that you ever had it? Alexander turned to look at him. What's the difference? Everything, the man said simply. One is loss, the other is awakening. His name was Father Michael, not a priest anymore, he clarified, retired years ago after his own crisis of faith. Now he just spent his days in the park, feeding birds and talking to lost souls. "And you look very lost, my friend," he said to Alexander. Over the next hour, Alexander found himself telling this stranger everything: the collapse, the betrayal, the loneliness, the suffocating question of what his life had been for. Father Michael listened without interruption. When Alexander finally finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Can I tell you what I think broke you? It wasn't the loss of money or status or even the people who abandoned you. What broke you was the realization that you had built your entire identity on sand, on things that could be taken away. And when they were taken, you discovered there was nothing underneath, no foundation, no self that existed independent of achievement." Alexander felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "So what do I do? How do I rebuild from that?" Father Michael smiled gently. "You don't rebuild, you excavate. You dig down past the rubble of what you lost until you find bedrock. The part of you that was there before success, before ambition, before fear. That's what makes a man unbreakable. Not what he builds on top, but what he's built from underneath." Over the next 4 months, Alexander met Father Michael in that park 3 times a week. They talked about identity, meaning, purpose, and the difference between a life built on achievement and a life built on foundation. And slowly, painfully, Alexander began to excavate. He started with a question Father Michael gave him. Who were you at 15 before you decided to prove something to the world? Alexander had to dig deep into memory. 15. He was a kid who loved building things. Not for recognition or money, but because the act of creation itself brought him joy. He would spend hours in his garage taking apart electronics and putting them back together. Not to impress anyone. His parents were too busy fighting to notice. His classmates thought he was weird. But in those moments of pure creation, Alexander felt whole. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped creating for joy and started creating to prove, to escape, to become someone the world couldn't ignore. "There's your foundation," Father Michael said when Alexander shared this. "That 15-year-old who created for the love of creation. He's still in there, buried under 30 years of achievement addiction, but he's your bedrock. Everything you built on top of him was scaffolding. Impressive scaffolding, sure, but temporary. What makes you unbreakable isn't the empire you built. It's reconnecting with that kid who found meaning in the act of creation itself." The first real lesson came during their 7th meeting. Alexander was spiraling about his reputation. "How do I ever come back from this? My name is poison. No one will ever trust me again." Father Michael looked at him seriously. "Why do you need them to trust you?" Alexander frowned. "Because without their trust, I can't rebuild. I can't do anything." "Wrong," Father Michael said firmly. "You're still looking outside yourself for validation. That's what broke you in the first place. True strength doesn't come from others believing in you. It comes from you believing in yourself regardless of what others think." "But that's arrogant," Alexander protested. "Is it?" Father Michael challenged. "Or is it the only real freedom? As long as your sense of self depends on external validation, you will always be vulnerable to external destruction. Someone will always have the power to break you by withdrawing their approval. But if your sense of self comes from within, from your own values and principles, then no one can take that from you." Alexander sat with that. "How do I build that? I don't even know what my values are anymore." "Then that's the work," Father Michael said simply. "Not rebuilding your company, not restoring your reputation, but discovering what you actually stand for when no one's watching." The second lesson emerged when Alexander started volunteering at a youth center. Father Michael had suggested it. Go be useful to someone who can't do anything for you. Learn what service without expectation feels like. Alexander was skeptical, but went anyway. He started teaching basic coding to teenagers from low-income neighborhoods. Kids who reminded him of himself at that age. Hungry, determined, dreaming of escape through achievement. One kid, Isaiah, was particularly brilliant. 15 years old, already coding at a college level. After class one day, Isaiah asked Alexander, "How did you get so successful?" Alexander almost gave his usual answer, the one about hard work and vision and perseverance. But something stopped him. He looked at this kid and saw himself. And he made a choice to tell the truth. "I got successful by sacrificing everything that actually mattered. I worked 80-hour weeks, missed my mother's funeral for a business trip, destroyed relationships because work came first. I made billions, and I was miserable, successful, and empty." Isaiah looked shocked. "But you had everything." "I had nothing," Alexander corrected. "I had things, lots of things, but I had no one, no real connections, no peace, no self outside of achievement. And when it all collapsed, I realized I had wasted decades building a prison and calling it a palace." He leaned forward. "Isaiah, you're brilliant. You're going to be successful. But please, don't do what I did. Don't sacrifice your humanity on the altar of achievement. Success is great, but not at the cost of your soul." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "Then why do you teach us coding? Isn't that just preparing us for the same trap?" "No," Alexander said. "I teach you coding because creation is beautiful, because building things brings joy, because using your gifts matters. But I'm also here to tell you, you are not what you create. You are not your achievements. You are a human being with inherent worth, and no success or failure changes that. Ever." The third lesson hit Alexander like lightning during a conversation with his estranged daughter, Sophie. She was 23 and hadn't spoken to him in over a year, even before the collapse. Father Michael had encouraged him. Make amends not because you expect forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. Alexander had resisted. The shame was too great. But finally, he sent a message. Sophie agreed to meet, though her response was cold. They sat in a coffee shop. The tension was immediate. Sophie didn't waste time. Why now? After everything, why reach out now? Alexander took a breath. "Because I owe you an apology, and because I'm finally ready to give it without excuses." Sophie crossed her arms. "I'm listening." "I was a terrible father. I prioritized work over you, every time. Your school plays, your graduation, your heartbreaks, I was somewhere else chasing a deal. I told myself I was providing for you, building a legacy for you. But the truth is, I was running from intimacy, from vulnerability, from being a real parent." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Do you know what it's like to grow up feeling like you're not enough? Like you're constantly competing with a company for your father's attention and always losing?" Alexander felt the weight of it. "No, but I can imagine, and I'm sorry, truly sorry." Sophie wiped her eyes. "What changed? Is it just because you lost everything and now you're lonely?"
"Maybe," Alexander admitted. "Maybe I needed to lose everything to realize what I actually lost years ago. You, your brother, your mother, real connection. I traded the irreplaceable for the temporary, and now I'm trying to understand who I am when I'm not performing success." Sophie was quiet. "Are you different? Really different? Or is this just another performance?" Alexander met her eyes. "I don't know yet. I'm trying to be different. I'm doing the work. But I understand if you need to protect yourself from me. I've earned your distrust." Sophie studied him. "I don't want apologies, Dad. I want to know if you're capable of being real, of being present, of being a person instead of a brand." "I'm learning," Alexander said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I'm learning." The fourth lesson came during a panic attack 6 months into Alexander's new life. He was lying awake at 3 in the morning, the fear crushing his chest. What if he could never work again? What if the legal battles destroyed what little he had left? What if he died alone and forgotten? The spiral was vicious. He called Father Michael, desperate. The old man answered, voice groggy but kind. "Talk to me, Alexander. I can't do this. The uncertainty, the not knowing. I feel like I'm drowning." Father Michael was quiet for a moment. "What are you certain of right now, in this exact moment?" Alexander forced himself to focus. "I'm breathing. I'm alive. I'm talking to you." "Good. What else?" "I have a roof over my head tonight. I have food. I'm physically safe. And I have a choice. Right now, I can choose to spiral, or I can choose to breathe." "That's it," Father Michael said gently. "That's the foundation of Unbreakable. Not certainty about the future, not control over outcomes, but the ability to come back to this moment and recognize, right now, I am okay. Right now, I have what I need. The future is unknowable. It always has been. But in this moment, you are whole." Alexander felt his breathing slow. "How do I make this feeling last?" "You don't," Father Michael said. "You return to it, again and again. Every time fear pulls you into imaginary futures, you come back to now. That's the practice. That's what makes you unbreakable. Not that you never break, but that you know how to return to center." The fifth and final lesson came a year after the collapse. Alexander had rebuilt a small life. Not empire, not status, but something real. He was still teaching at the youth center, had weekly dinners with Sophie, slowly rebuilding trust, had coffee with Father Michael every Sunday, worked part-time doing freelance consulting for nonprofits, made enough to live simply, owned almost nothing, and felt more at peace than he ever had with billions. One day, an old colleague from his former company reached out. The legal investigations had cleared, the fraud charges were dropped, evidence showed he wasn't involved in the accounting irregularities.
His name could be restored. "There are investors interested in backing you," the colleague said. "You could rebuild, come back, show everyone they were wrong about you." Alexander listened and felt nothing. No excitement, no hunger, no need to prove anything. "Thank you," Alexander said, "but I'm good where I am." The colleague was shocked. "You're turning down a chance to rebuild your empire?" "I'm turning down a chance to rebuild a prison," Alexander clarified. "I spent 30 years being a billionaire, and I was broken. Now I spend my days being useful to people who can't give me anything in return, and I'm whole. That's not a trade I'm willing to reverse." What broke the billionaire was the discovery that everything he built his identity on was temporary, fragile, conditional. What made him unbreakable was the excavation of something deeper, a sense of self that wasn't dependent on achievement, approval, or external circumstances. Alexander Hunt lost everything, and in the loss he found the only thing that actually matters, himself. Not the performed self, not the achieving self, but the essential self that exists before ambition and after collapse. The billionaire who could be broken by losing his empire became the man who couldn't be broken because he no longer needed the empire to know who he was. That is the transformation. That is what makes someone truly unbreakable. Not invulnerability to loss, but independence from external definition. Alexander learned what the ancients knew. You are not what you have. You are not what you achieve. You are what remains when everything else is stripped away. And what remains, when you dig deep enough, is always enough. So ask yourself, what would break you? And more importantly, what would make you unbreakable? The answer isn't in building bigger, it's in digging deeper. Past achievement, past reputation, past fear. Down to the bedrock of who you are when no one's watching and nothing's at stake. That's where you find your foundation. That's where you become unbreakable. If this story resonated, subscribe for more journeys of transformation. Share it with someone who needs this reminder. And remember, what breaks you reveals what you were building on. What makes you unbreakable is what you discover underneath. Start digging. The foundation is there, waiting.